At the Quiet Rock Ridge truck stop in rural Texas, three women, Ellie, Margie, and a customer named Calvin Mercer, find themselves cornered when four aggressive bikers storm in. What begins as crude jokes quickly turns into intimidation. Calvin, a former Marine turned quiet trucker, leaves without confrontation. At first. But when things escalate, he returns not with violence, but with resolve. Outside, he slashes the bikers' tires and calls in a silent network of veteran truckers. As big rigs form a steel perimeter around the lot, the balance shifts. And inside, the bullies begin to realize they're no longer in charge. If this story stirred something in you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us tell more stories of quiet heroes and everyday courage. Drop a comment to share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Together, let's keep standing up for what's right. Even Calvin's gaze, steady as it had been all night, lifted toward the sound. The rumble grew louder, closer, aggressive in its rhythm. Outside, headlights swung across the parking lot, slicing through the shadows like a spotlight, hunting something unspoken. The door creaked open, letting in the echo of boot steps before it even shut. Hawk came in first, tall, sunburned, with a wiry tension in his limbs that spoke of too much booze and too little consequence. Behind him, Tank lumbered in, grinning wide and already reaching for a beer from the fridge without asking. The two were regulars of a sort, but not the kind anyone welcomed. Ellie tensed, Margie stiffened. Calvin didn't move. "You girls get lonely out here at night?" Hawk's voice slithered across the counter like spilled oil, lazy but laced with menace. He leaned in, his breath sour and hot, and let his fingers hover far too close to Ellie's cheek. "Bet you'd be sweeter if you smiled for us." Ellie froze, her hand clenched near the register. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she held her ground. "Leave her alone." Betty's voice cracked as she stepped forward, fragile but fierce, the words trembling in the air like a dare. She was shaking, her jaw tight. Tank laughed, loud and sharp, tossing a dented beer can over the counter with a clang. "What's Grandma gonna do? Cry?" From the corner booth, Calvin Mercer had already seen enough. He placed his mug down gently, reached for his wallet, and slid a few bills under the edge of the cup. Without a word, he stood, his movements slow, measured, and walked out the door into the thick, humid dark. Inside, silence fell like a dropped curtain. Ellie's fingers gripped the receipt printer tighter. Hawk leaned closer, his voice a low rasp meant only for her. Margie took a small step forward but didn't speak. No one else dared breathe. Then the door chimed again. Everyone turned. Calvin Mercer stepped back into the room. Not alone. Two men followed behind him, quiet, deliberate, unflinching. Calvin didn't look away from Hawk. His eyes, cool and flint gray, locked onto the younger man's face. His voice, calm but absolute, cut through the air like a blade. "That's enough," he said. In that instant, something shifted. The mood, the posture, even the very air. It was as if gravity itself tilted toward Calvin, as though every inch of the room suddenly remembered what respect felt like. Hawk faltered. Tank's grin vanished. The rain outside had stopped an hour ago, but the world beyond the truck stop still glistened with the memory of it. The parking lot shimmered under the flickering neon sign, its red light pulsing like a heartbeat above the store. A gentle wind stirred the puddles. Inside, the coffee machine burbled, a low reminder of normalcy amid tension. The Rock Ridge stop, tucked along a quiet stretch of Highway 40, didn't see much action. But tonight it was the setting for something older than justice, something instinctive, primal. Calvin Mercer didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His stance said everything. His shoulders squared, his jaw set, his eyes unwavering. Hawk might have been louder, younger, cockier. But Calvin had history in his bones, and that kind of weight couldn't be faked or ignored. Hawk looked away first. The moment passed like a held breath finally exhaled. Tank shifted uneasily, the beer in his hand now forgotten. Ellie stayed frozen, her heart still racing. Margie relaxed her shoulders a fraction. Calvin stood still, watching, waiting, making sure. Then, as quietly as he had come, he turned and walked back out into the night. No one stopped him. No one had to. Because sometimes peace doesn't come with sirens or speeches. Sometimes it arrives in silence. wrapped in worn denim and carried on the shoulders of a man who's seen too much and still chooses to stand between harm and the innocent. He shifted barely an inch toward the front window, just as the scream of engines tore through the night. Four motorcycles shot into the lot like a pack of wolves, their headlights slashing through the wet dark, casting sharp halos on the glistening asphalt. They lined up in a tight, arrogant row, chrome snarling under the neon signage, engines grumbling like they weren't done yet. The lead rider swung his leg off with a dramatic snap, boots hitting the pavement like gunshots. He tore off his helmet, revealing a mess of oily black hair that clung to his face. His leather vest bore a single bold patch. Hawk. But he didn't need it. His presence alone announced him louder than any name tag. He moved with the kind of swagger that said the world owed him, and tonight he'd come to collect. His arms were a canvas of ink, both sleeves running shoulder to wrist. A faded Confederate flag circled one bicep like a warning no one had asked for, and a jagged scar carved its way down his neck, a souvenir from some past violence he likely welcomed. Behind him followed his crew. Tank, squat and round like a wrecking ball, grinned wide with a mouth that fired off words like shells. His laugh cracked loud and raw. Razer trailed next, thin and twitchy, his left eye spasming every few seconds like it was always on edge. And last was Viper, young, overeager, chewing his gum with the intensity of a man trying too hard to prove something. The bell above the door gave two sharp dings as the group stormed inside. They didn't walk in, they invaded. The room instantly shrank around them. "Well, what do we have here?" Hawk sneered, eyes sweeping the cramped convenience store. "Ain't this a sweet little dump?" Behind the counter, Ellie straightened her spine and forced a brittle smile. "Can I help you gentlemen with anything?" Hawk didn't answer. He stepped right up to the counter, eyes slowly tracing her face, deliberate and unhurried, as though appraising her like a thing rather than a person. "You girls get lonely out here at night?" he asked, voice slick with sarcasm. "Bet you'd be a whole lot sweeter if you smiled." His hand hovered near her cheek, close enough to be felt, not quite touching. Ellie recoiled, taking a small but sharp step back. "Leave her alone," Margie cut in, her voice quiet but edged with steel as she stepped forward. Hawk turned his head, amused by the interruption. Tank let out a bark of laughter and tossed a dented beer can over the counter with a casual flick. "What's Grandma gonna do, call the sheriff?" From the corner booth, Calvin Mercer remained still. One hand rested on his coffee mug, the other lay flat on the table. His eyes missed nothing. Hawk's shifting stance, Razor's fingers idly brushing against the candy rack, Viper subtly edging toward the side entrance to the counter. Calvin didn't look worried. He looked like a man running numbers in his head. Watching. Waiting. "Hey, sweetheart," Viper called, leaning toward Ellie from the side, his tone dripping with fake charm. "You ever ride a real Harley? I could show you a good time." Ellie's hands tightened around the receipt printer, her jaw locked tight. "No thanks," she muttered, voice flat and controlled. Hawk leaned in closer, enough for her to smell stale beer and sweat. "Oh, come on now, you deserve more than this. Bet you'd look real fine with the wind in your hair." Before Ellie could move, Margie stepped forward again. "That's enough." Hawk glanced at her, entertained. "You're a bold one, I like that." "Then show some respect," she snapped back. Razer wandered behind the register and spun the dial on the old radio until heavy rock erupted from the speakers, loud and jarring. The sudden blast of distorted guitars cracked the air like a slap. Margie winced, covering her ears. "This place needed some noise," Tank said with a grin, then kicked over a mop bucket, its contents sloshing across the floor. Ellie moved toward the radio to turn it down, but Hawk blocked her path, stepping in so close she could see the worn stitching on his vest. "No, no, leave it, sweetheart," he said, flashing teeth. "The party's just getting started." Then he leaned in again, closer than before, his breath hot and sour. "Maybe you could join us." Ellie backed up until the counter hit her spine. She had nowhere left to go. From across the room, Calvin's gaze narrowed. He still hadn't moved, not a single muscle. But inside, something shifted, not fear, something colder. A silence heavy with memory, the kind that settles just before things change. He waited, because Calvin Mercer's new timing wasn't everything. It was the thing. The music rattled the store now, shaking chip racks and making the walls hum. Razer cackled and spun the volume knob all the way to its limit. Guitars wailed like sirens. Somewhere behind them, a shelf of snacks gave up and collapsed. Margie flinched. "Turn that down," she shouted, trying to pierce the noise. Her voice held, but only barely. Hawk pivoted away from Ellie. "What's that, Grandma?" "I said turn it down." Smiling, Hawk stomped toward the back of the counter, his steps deliberately heavy. Without warning, he lunged and ripped the phone off its cradle, letting the receiver clatter uselessly behind the register. "No need for backup," he said. "We're just making friends." Margie went rigid. "That's enough, Hawk." He leaned in close, mocking. "You know my name." "That's sweet." Then he tilted his head toward Ellie again. "You girls got anyone out here looking out for you? Husbands? Boyfriends? Cops on speed dial?" Ellie said nothing. Her eyes were locked on the linoleum floor, jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. Her grip on the receipt printer was white-knuckled. Like if she held it tightly enough, it might somehow shield her from all of this. And then Calvin Mercer stood up. Quietly, intentionally, slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few worn, crumpled bills. He placed the bills carefully on the counter, smoothing them flat before letting go. "For the coffee," he murmured, his voice low and steady. Then he turned, heading toward the door. Tank gave a sharp snort. "Guess the old man's had enough." "Nana, that's too bad," Hawk called out after him, taking a few steps forward, his tone laced with mock amusement. "I was starting to enjoy the company." Calvin didn't respond. His footsteps tapped softly across the tile, calm and unhurried. When he reached the door, his hand reached for the handle, fingers closing around it with a quiet finality. But just as he began to open it, thap. A hollow metallic crack cut through the room as an empty beer can struck him squarely between the shoulder blades. It dropped to the floor and rattled, its echo lingering in the sudden stillness that followed. Time seemed to hold its breath. Hawk's voice sliced through the silence, smug and sharp. "You forgot your trash, old man." Calvin didn't move. Not right away. He stood with his back to the room, spine straight, hand resting on the doorframe. He didn't flinch, didn't even shift his weight. The only sound now was the warbled hum of distorted music overhead, speaker pushed too far, volume up too loud. Then slowly, with the kind of deliberate grace that made people nervous, he turned. His eyes met Hawk's, steady and unreadable. There was no heat in them, no anger, no fear, just presence. "What's wrong?" Hawk taunted, stepping forward, puffing his chest like a rooster. "Aren't you going to say goodbye? Still, Calvin remained silent. Razer edged in on Calvin's left. Tank stood to his right, tense, ready. Viper leaned lazily against the chip rack, grinning like he'd already won something. "You don't talk much, do you?" Hawk mocked. "That's rude. You should apologize for just walking out like that. Real bad manners." Calvin's breath came in slow, even, controlled. Then finally he spoke. "I was just leaving." Hawk sneered. "Not yet, you're not." He pressed his palm against Calvin's chest and gave a firm push. It wasn't violent, but the message was clear. "Say you're sorry." Calvin looked down at the hand, looked back at Hawk. For the briefest moment, his jaw tensed. Ellie's eyes widened. Margie leaned forward, an instinctive half-step, uncertain. Then something happened that no one had predicted. Calvin gave a small nod, and then, clearly, simply, he said, "Sorry." The word dropped like a stone in still water. No trace of sarcasm, no weakness. Just that one syllable, spoken with the kind of quiet weight only a man like Calvin Mercer could carry. The room froze. Hawk blinked, visibly thrown. "There we go," he said, a single clap breaking the silence. "See? Easy, wasn't it?" Calvin turned again, reached for the door. This time he opened it wide. The cold night air surged into the convenience store, sharp and clean, like the breath of something older and wiser. Behind him, Hawk let out a triumphant laugh. Tank barked out a crude comment. Razer whooped, drunk on the moment. Ellie stood frozen in place, her emotions a tangle. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Nobody in that room really knew what Calvin was thinking, but maybe they should have. Outside, Calvin walked slowly toward his Peterbilt, the great rig resting just on the edge of the lot, engine ticking softly in the cold, cooling after a long idle. He stopped by the cab and placed his hand on the chrome handle, but he didn't climb in, not yet. Instead, he circled the truck, moving to the passenger side. He crouched low, reached beneath the running board, and pulled out a long black sheath. The metal inside caught the faint light. His M9 bayonet, 30 years on the road, 30 years of dodging trouble, keeping his head down. But tonight wasn't about him. He looked back at the truck stop. Inside, the bikers moved carelessly beneath the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, wild gestures, loud voices, laughter without substance. Ellie and Margie were still at the counter, still alone. And Calvin Mercer wasn't the kind of man who could walk away from that. Not before, not now. The night air felt colder now. In the shadows beside his truck, Calvin stood with the weight of the past tightening around his grip. His fingers curled around the bayonet's handle. Marine issue, familiar as breath. It still glinted faintly, catching light from the flickering lot lamps overhead. He hadn't used it in years. Not for anything serious. Just rope, tarp straps, insulation. Tools for the road. But tonight wasn't about tools. Tonight was about principle. Across the lot, 4 Harleys sat like thrones, lined up in arrogant pride. Chrome gleamed. Paint screamed. Each frame was sculpted to impress. Calvin walked toward them, silent, patient. His boots made no sound on the damp asphalt. No one inside would hear a thing. Not over the pounding bass and the bark of their own self-importance. He moved carefully, one by one. The blade slid into each thick tire sidewall, smooth and practiced. Not deep enough to cause a blowout. Just enough for the air to whisper out in a long, quiet hiss. A breath, a sigh, like the soul slipping out of a beast. 1 tire, then 2, 3, 4. Each Harley dipped lower, frames sagging like giants brought to their knees by nothing more than time and certainty. When it was done, Calvin returned to the edge of the lot, melting into the shadows along the side of the truck stop building. From his jacket pocket, he pulled a battered old flip phone. No touchscreen, no apps, just rubber buttons, chipped and cracked. On the bow, a Marine Corps emblem sticker, half peeled. He scrolled past his list of saved contacts until he reached a group labeled Brothers of the Road. It was a quiet circle, mostly ex-military truckers who'd stayed in touch across the years. Different units, different wars, but the same code etched deep in their bones. Calvin didn't call on them often, but when he did, they answered. He typed, Rock Ridge stop, 4 bikers harassing staff, need backup, no police, just presence. He hit send, then waited. The wind whispered past the gas pumps, the only sound in the stillness. Then, in less than 30 seconds, a response blinked onto Calvin's screen. Big Walt, on my way, brother, 10 minutes out. Calvin allowed himself the barest smile. Big Walt, Walter Higgins, stood 6'7" and weighed in at 300 pounds of pure muscle and iron nerves. He was a former convoy gunner who now hauled livestock, a man Calvin hadn't laid eyes on in more than a year. Yet he could still remember that handshake, like clutching a cinder block wrapped in worn leather. Another string of messages followed, a quick succession like a rallying drumbeat. Tommy R., turning back 5 minutes. Red Mike already nearby, circling in. Duke, say the word. I roll heavy. Calvin closed the phone and slid it back into his jacket pocket. It was done. The signal had gone out. The wheels were in motion now. He leaned back against his truck, arms folded, the bayonet quietly hidden beneath the seat once more. The wind tugged at his collar, sharp and restless. He lit a cigarette, his single vice, and fixed his eyes on the road. And just like that, right on cue, the night began to change. It started with headlights, 1 pair, then another, then 3 more, slicing through the dark like searchlights, sweeping an empty sea. The first truck to pull in was a matte black Kenworth T80, its front grille battle-worn and scarred from years of hauling steel and lumber. Behind it, a pale blue Freightliner Cascadia rumbled softly, like a predator in deep slumber. Next came a red Volvo VNL, flanked tightly by 2 long-nosed Western Stars, engines growling low. Not loud or boastful, but full of restrained force. They didn't park in rows. This wasn't a rest stop. It was a formation, A quiet strategy. One rig positioned itself by the entrance. Two more blocked the rear exit. Another idled across from the fuel pumps, its headlights casting long shadows. The last two trucks eased forward and parked nose to nose by the diesel island, creating a barricade of chrome and steel. Then came Big Walt. He rolled in behind the wheel of a white Peterbilt 389, blue racing stripes across its sides and an old battered Marine Corps flag painted proudly on the back. He pulled broadside across the main entrance, sealing it off completely. Then he stepped down. No hurry, no performance, just presence. Walt spotted Calvin instantly and gave a small, knowing nod before walking across the pavement like a man approaching the pulpit. He wore a denim vest over a worn flannel shirt, thick forearms bare to the wind, old tattoos faded but sharp with meaning. His beard was coarse like a wire brush, and his eyes were still, deep, like a calm lake before a storm. "What's the situation?" he asked. Calvin tilted his head toward the truck stop's glowing windows. Inside, the shadows of Hulk and his crew moved about the counter like restless wolves. "Inside," Calvin said. "Ellie and Margie are alone." Walt followed his line of sight. When he spotted the slashed tires outside, he gave a dry, amused smirk. "You always were surgical." Calvin didn't return the smile. "Didn't want blood," he said. "Just needed them stuck." Engines continued to idle across the lot as more drivers emerged. Some leaned casually against their fenders. Others stood silently by their doors. No instructions were given, no weapons drawn. They simply stood there. Men of the road, men who'd seen the long nights, men who didn't tolerate cowards hiding behind noise and swagger. Inside, the laughter had started to die. The bell above the truck stop's door rang again, but this time it brought no jeers, no stomping boots. It was the kind of chime that stops a room cold. Hawk stood behind the counter, arms splayed wide like he owned the place. Tank was half buried in the cooler, searching for another beer. Razer played with the music controls. Viper tossed snack bags onto the floor, entertained by the crinkling sound. Ellie had retreated into the corner behind the register, shrinking against the wall. Margie stood next to her, spine stiff, arms crossed, lips pressed into a grim line. The noise dulled, but the air still buzzed with tension, like smoke lingering after a fire. And then they stepped in. Calvin Mercer, Big Walt. No shouting, no threats, just gravity. Walt filled the doorway with his frame, silent, unmoving, his silhouette stretched across the linoleum like an omen. Next to him, Calvin stepped forward, slow and steady, as if the rules of mass and motion didn't quite apply to him. The music still played from the back, but now it felt out of place, almost absurd. Hawk turned, smirk forming, until he saw them. His cocky grin wavered. "Back so soon, Grandpa?" he jeered, reaching for arrogance. "Forget your manners again?" Calvin didn't answer right away. He simply walked forward, deliberate. His eyes locked onto Hawk's and didn't flinch. Behind him, Walt crossed his arms. No words. Just a wall of weight and resolve. Two more truckers stood visible in the windows, leaned against their rigs, watching. No smiles, no signals, just presence. The room suddenly felt much smaller. "You okay, sweetheart?" Calvin asked, glancing toward Ellie. She nodded, just barely. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. Margie didn't take her eyes off Calvin. She didn't speak either. She didn't have to. Hawk gave a forced laugh, louder than needed. "So this is it? You brought backup?" he scoffed. "A little army of has-beens come to teach us manners?" Walt took a single step forward, voice low and composed. "You boys might want to head on out." There was no threat in it, no growl or bark, just truth. Advice wrapped in iron, and it dropped like a stone in the center of the room. Razer shifted uneasily beside the drink machine, his posture betraying the discomfort that was creeping in. The bottle in Tank's hand remained untouched, held like a prop from a scene that had already passed. His stance was rigid, too still, as if movement might break something fragile. Viper stared out the window where more truckers were gathering, their silent presence a growing wall. Hawk glanced around, attempting to hold on to his smirk, but his jaw was clenched, the expression fading. Calvin finally spoke again, calm and clear. It's time you left. Hawk took a step forward, but it lacked the earlier swagger. We're paying customers, he snapped. No one said you weren't, Calvin replied, unmoved. You're free to leave whenever you're ready. You think you can run us off with a look? Hawk challenged. Leaning against the wall, Walt's tone was casual but steady. Son, if we wanted you gone, you'd already be gone. The words settled like a weight in the air. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with the quiet authority of men who didn't need to flex muscle to show power. They knew who they were and what they were capable of. Tank's voice was low. Yeah, maybe it's time. Razer gave a shrug that held no conviction and slowly backed away from the cooler. Viper said nothing. He just moved toward the exit like he'd already made the decision, though he couldn't remember when. Hawk's jaw clenched tighter. You're all nuts, he muttered. No, Calvin said firmly. We're just done letting bullies think no one will ever push back. That broke the spell. The four bikers turned and filed toward the door, not chased, not shoved, just dismissed. The bell over the door chimed lightly as they exited, and outside they froze. Their four Harleys sat low, their frames sagging with tires that had gone completely flat. The chrome that once gleamed now looked dull, the bikes stripped of their swagger. Around them, the big rigs had boxed them in, parked deliberately, tightly, with no path forward. There would be no roaring exit, no dramatic escape. What the hell? Hawk growled, striding to his bike. Tank kicked one of the flattened tires, fury written on his face. Razer scanned the lot, eyes wide, confused. Viper still didn't speak, only stood there in disbelief. Behind them, Calvin and Walt stood in the doorway. More truckers stepped forward, casual in their approach. One lit a cigarette, other took a slow sip from a thermos. None of them said a word. What did you do? Hawk hissed, eyes narrowed. Calvin raised a brow, voice level. Something wrong with your tires? You slashed them, Hawk accused. I didn't see anything, Walt added, folding his arms across his chest. Did you? The other truckers, deadpan, shook their heads. Nope. Must have been a bad batch, one of them said. Rubber's not what it used to be. There was nothing left for Hawk to argue. The fight had been drained from the air. All that remained was the sting of defeat. He turned, eyes catching the circle of truck headlights that glowed like watchful eyes, silent sentinels of justice. No words could salvage pride now. No show of strength would undo the humiliation. He gripped the handlebars and began to push. The other bikers followed, dragging their crippled machines across the gravel. Calvin didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply stood like a man whose job was done, like a weight had finally been lifted. Peace returned. Behind him, Ellie exhaled a breath she hadn't noticed she'd been holding. Beside her, Margie allowed herself the faintest smile, the kind that comes after surviving a storm. Under the faded orange haze of the overhead lights, four silhouettes trudged slowly across the lot, each pushing a lifeless Harley-Davidson. No words passed between them, just the sounds of tires scraping pavement, metal clinking, and boots dragging through loose gravel. Hawk led, his face stone, eyes set ahead. Razer followed, dragging his bike like it was a dead animal. Tank muttered curses, none with direction. Viper, head down, looked as if each step drained him. They passed the line of rigs in silence, shame thick around them. None of the truckers moved. None sneered or mocked. No need. That would have lessened the moment. The silence itself was a sentence, and it was enough. One after another, the bikers vanished into the darkness. No thunder of engines, no bravado, just the slow, silent retreat of men who had miscalculated their power. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried out into the wind. The sound had an edge, something between a howl and laughter. Back inside the Rock Ridge truck stop, calm had settled once more. The music was off, the mess had been cleaned, the cooler door was closed again. Margie stood at the counter, arms crossed, watching through the window with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Ellie stood beside her, still pale but steadier now. Her fingers had stopped shaking. Her breathing had evened out. Calvin approached the counter and placed a $10 bill on top of an old coffee receipt. For the refill, he said. They both knew he'd never taken the refill. Ellie blinked, Her voice came out soft, almost fragile. "Thank you for coming back." Calvin gave a slow, approving nod. "You did good." Ellie opened her mouth, maybe to protest, to claim she hadn't really done anything, but Calvin lifted his hand gently. "You stood your ground," he said. "That's more than most ever do." He turned to leave, but just before the door, he paused, looked back, and said in a quiet voice, "Don't let—" Ellie didn't cry, but something deeper shimmered in her gaze. A quiet resolve, slowly forming, thread by thread, like armor being forged in silence. Her eyes weren't filled with tears, but with a steady light, the kind that comes not from breaking, but from choosing not to. Margie saw it and gently rested a hand on her shoulder, offering comfort without words. It was a small gesture, but one that meant everything in that moment. Outside, the trucks were coming alive again, their engines growling to life one after another. Taillights lit up red in the dusk. The familiar low hum of diesel engines filled the air, not triumphant, not dramatic. This wasn't a celebration or a victory march. It was just another end to another long shift, the kind only men who've seen too much and talked about it too little understand. Big Walt caught Calvin's eye, giving him a single solemn nod before climbing back into his truck. "If you ever need us again," Walt said, not as a question, but as a promise. "I know," Calvin answered. "Let's hope I don't." Walt's laughter was a low, gravelly chuckle, and then he vanished into his cab like a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. Calvin turned and stepped into his own rig, the red Peterbilt 389 that had been his steady companion through 30 years in 20 states. The door hung open for a moment as he sat behind the wheel, casting a final glance at the store behind him. The lights inside now glowed with a warm, reassuring hue. They looked safe again. He shut the door with calm finality, started the engine, and rolled onto the road. Not fast, not slow, just moving forward. No lights, no crowd, no applause. Just a man, seasoned and silent, heading toward whatever waited in the next mile. Silence doesn't always mean giving up. Sometimes it's the breath between decision and action, the stillness before the storm, or the final calm after one. It's the quiet threshold where conviction settles in, where someone decides enough. In a world overwhelmed by noise, it's often those who speak the least who carry the greatest resolve. Calvin Mercer doesn't need a badge to matter. He doesn't want medals, doesn't seek titles. He doesn't need recognition to do what's right. He keeps watch in the unnoticed corners. An old truck stop, a lonely road, a dim-lit store, waiting. He stands where trouble might tip the balance and steps in only when needed. When justice calls, he doesn't raise a voice. He simply arrives. In a time where volume often drowns out value, where spectacle overshadows substance, Calvin reminds us of something we've nearly forgotten: the quiet strength of integrity. His courage wasn't loud. His bravery didn't swing fists. It lived in patience, in knowing when to act and when to hold the line. He showed us that real dignity doesn't shout. It endures, and he's not alone. Across small towns and big cities, at coffee counters and checkout lines, there are people like Ellie, working hard, quietly, carrying more than they ever show. People like Margie, unshakable, standing guard in simple ways, giving more than they take, even when it costs them comfort. And perhaps, in the corners we overlook, there are still Calvins too, men and women who no longer wear a uniform, but still live by an unspoken code. What would you have done if you were Calvin? Have you ever had to stand your ground without raising your voice? We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Share your story, whether it's a moment from your life or just how this story touched you. Let's keep this conversation alive. And if Calvin's quiet strength meant something to you, if this story moved you even a little, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and pass it on to someone who still believes in doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. Thanks for being here.